Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to try something a little different. We're diving into Chinese funeral traditions.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and we're going to be looking at them through this firsthand account from someone who, well, recently attended one.
Okay, cool.
It gets pretty in-depth and, well, pretty interesting, too, when they start talking about things like, pole dancing at funerals.
Pole dancing
Yeah.
at a funeral.
Yeah, apparently it used to be, like, somewhat common in some parts of China.
Yeah.
The idea was to entertain the deceased's spirit. But our source says that it's not as common now, kind of fading out.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Why?
China's been modernizing pretty rapidly, and I guess some of the older traditions, well, I guess they might seem kind of out of place now.
Right. Especially with, how they're presenting themselves on the global stage.
Exactly. It really shows how cultures, change and adapt over time.
It does. It's fascinating to see how things evolve. But what's interesting is that this account, it goes way beyond just the pole dancing thing. The author talks about some really, intense and personal rituals they saw at their grandfather's funeral.
Like what?
Well, they talk about crying, really loudly on purpose.
Yeah.
As a way for their grandfather's spirit to, hear their grief.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. Yeah, in Chinese culture, expressing your emotions very openly is really important, especially during times of mourning. It's a way to show respect.
Oh, definitely. It shows how deeply they feel the loss.
Exactly.
There's also this ritual where they kneel and then climb into the house where the body is,
Yeah.
to say goodbye. The author doesn't give too many details, but you can just, feel how emotional it must have been.
I can imagine.
But here's where things get a bit more complex. The author describes this tradition where the eldest grandson, he receives this red envelope full of money, and he's supposed to use it to buy new clothes, and he's the one who leads the funeral procession. It's very specific, though. Eldest grandson, no girls allowed.
This really gets to the heart of something the author brings up a lot in their account, gender disparity.
Yeah. And they talk about how this whole tradition, it really bothered them, and how they talked about it with their female cousin and their aunt.
Oh, interesting.
Their cousin, brought up how unfair it all seemed, naturally. But then their aunt, who's Buddhist, she explained it in terms of, past lives and karma. She believes that women are basically, being punished in this life for sins from a past one.
That's a really interesting perspective. While it might be difficult for some to hear, that explanation actually connects to these bigger cultural and philosophical beliefs that have shaped Chinese society for, centuries.
Yeah.
You have Confucianism, which really stresses respecting elders, filial piety, and a family structure that's very hierarchical, where men typically hold more power. And then there's Buddhism with, the idea of karma and rebirth, which sometimes people interpret it to reinforce those existing social hierarchies.
Right.
Even though those beliefs might be fading in modern China, they still have an impact, especially on traditions like this.
That's a good point. It's definitely a complex issue, huh? It shows how tradition and, evolving social norms, they can sometimes clash a bit.
Yeah.
What really struck me, though, is how this whole funeral experience was like a turning point for the author.
Oh.
It wasn't just about, seeing these rituals. It was about realizing, truly recognizing the gender inequality within their own culture.
Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, they mentioned how their youngest uncle, well, he inherited almost everything from their grandfather. And it's not just about the red envelope anymore. It's about the, disadvantages women often face with inheritance and property rights.
Yeah.
And what's worse is, uncle ended up mistreating his sisters, who are the author's mother and aunts.
That's awful.
Yeah.
Sadly, that anecdote really shows how traditional beliefs, about gender, how they can have real consequences impacting women's lives in very tangible ways. It's not just an idea, it's their lived reality.
Exactly. And that's what makes this account so powerful. It's personal, it's honest, and it starts a much bigger conversation about, gender equality in China and really everywhere.
What's fascinating here is how the author's experience, with their grandfather's funeral, it becomes this catalyst for change. They don't just watch these traditions, they start to question them and their impact on women's lives.
And it's that questioning, that willingness to challenge things that can really lead to progress.
Yeah.
Right? It's the first step towards getting rid of harmful traditions and creating a more just and fair world.
Yeah, it's like that funeral, it really opened their eyes.
Yeah.
Not just about death, but about all the inequality, too.
It really shows you, how these personal things, they can totally change how we see the world.
Totally. And, speaking of change, the author doesn't just focus on the bad stuff. They also talk about their mom, who had to deal with a lot from her brothers. She was determined to, like, break the cycle. And that really seemed to inspire the author, to fight for more equality.
It's interesting how that happens, like between generations. You've got the older generation, like the aunt, who explains things through tradition, right? And then the younger generation, the author and their cousin, they're questioning things, looking for a better way forward.
It's not even just questioning, it's about taking action. They specifically talk about wanting to empower women, create a better world for girls, especially in Asian cultures. Yeah, taking action, that's what matters. You can recognize a problem, but then what? It's about doing something.
I agree. This deep dive, it's been a journey, huh? We started with, like, pole dancing at funerals, which seemed, I don't know, kind of like a weird cultural thing. But now, well, now we're talking about some pretty heavy stuff. Tradition, gender roles,
Yeah.
and how personal stories can lead to change.
It's true. It shows you that even things that seem strange, maybe even outdated, they can tell you a lot about a culture. And in this case, it's definitely started a conversation about gender. Not just in China, but everywhere.
It makes
Yeah.
you wonder, right? What traditions have we just accepted without really thinking about them? Like, what do they say about us?
It's a good question. We don't always examine our own culture, but it's important to ask, like, what values are they upholding? Are they fair? Do they hurt some people? And if they do, what can we do to change them?
What was the most interesting thing for you about this deep dive?
Hmm. For me, it's that tension between tradition and being modern. Like, we respect our culture and history, but then we also see that some traditions might not be good anymore, especially when they go against our values, like equality and fairness.
Yeah, it's a balancing act, right? What do we keep? What do we change? And what do we, just leave behind? Plus, culture is always changing. What's happening in China with these funeral traditions, I think it reflects something bigger. Like people all over the world are pushing for more equality, even if it means questioning old beliefs.
It's almost like there's this worldwide conversation happening. Different cultures are trying to figure it out in their own way. And it's often the people who have been treated unfairly or silenced who are speaking up the most.
Their stories are so important because they make us confront uncomfortable things, make us question our own assumptions. It's
Yeah.
easy to ignore these issues if you haven't experienced them yourself.
Exactly. The author's story about their grandfather's funeral, with all the good and bad, it's a powerful reminder that change is possible, even with traditions that have been around for centuries. But it takes bravery, and often a personal story to get things started.
That's true. This deep dive has given us a lot to think about. Culture, gender roles, you know, and the power of personal stories. But I think more importantly, it shows that tradition and change aren't opposites. They can exist together, help each other, you know, as we try to create a better world.
It's a reminder that this journey, this evolution of culture, it's still happening. We need to keep talking, keep questioning.
Well said. Looking at these Chinese funeral traditions has really shown us how these rituals, even ones about death, can tell us a lot about a society's values.
Yeah, and it challenges us too to look at our own traditions and think about what messages they're sending. Are they about equality and fairness? Or are they, based on outdated ideas that hurt certain groups?
Yeah, it really makes you think. This whole deep dive has been, well, eye-opening, but it's also made me think about my own, traditions and stuff.
It's like looking in a mirror, right?
Mm.
At our own cultures. We see things we like, but also things that maybe need to change.
Yeah, I agree. And sometimes it takes hearing about someone else's experience,
Yeah.
like this funeral in China, to make us look at our own traditions differently.
What I find interesting is that the author, they don't just say everything about their culture is bad. They talk about the good things too, the important traditions,
Mhm.
but they also point out the stuff that, well, needs to change. It's a good perspective, I think.
Yeah, they're not trying to erase the past. It's more like figuring out what to keep, what to adapt, for a better future.
And that process, like rethinking things, challenging how things have always been done, it can be tough, but it's important, right? If we want everyone to feel like they matter.
It is. That's a really good point. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this. What traditions have you seen, maybe in your own life, that might be, connected to bigger problems in society? It can be hard to face those things, but it's the first step towards making the world a fairer place. Thanks for joining us on this journey.